Okay, so here's our chart that we've been filling out. So these are our properties. And I want to go ahead and we already have our parallelogram one filled out. So we're going to fill out the rectangle, the square, and the rhombus here at the bottom. So go ahead and get your shapes, and we should have these in class. And here's my rectangle. So I want to check the opposite sides and see if they're congruent. So I'm going to measure. And I get about 14.6 for the top and 14.6 for the bottom. So those are congruent. Then I have about 6.7 on the left and 6.7 on the right. So that does make them opposite sides congruent. Adjacent angles, adjacent sides, those were not the same. When I get my protractor and I measure my angles, I want to make sure that they are equal to 90 degrees. Okay, so there's 90 degrees. I'm going to confirm those are 90 degrees. That one's 90 degrees. And my last angle is 90 degrees. So I am confirming that the angles are 90 degrees based on our definitions. So when we come back to our properties chart, we're going to check off, were the opposite sides congruent? Yes, they were. Were the adjacent sides congruent? No, they weren't. Were the opposite angles congruent? Yes. Were the adjacent angles congruent? Yes. And they are still supplementary. Okay, now I need to work on the diagonals, so I am going to have to draw those in. And remember, those are the two non-adjacent vertices that are connected. They have to be non-adjacent, or else they would be the sides. I'm going to draw that in, and then I want to see, are the diagonals equal? So I'm going to measure them. And I get about 16 on that diagonal, and I get 16 on that diagonal. So yes, the diagonals are equal. Do they bisect each other? Well, since this is a parallelogram, and the diagonals bisect a parallelogram, they do bisect at the rectangle too, and my whole length was 16, and right at my point of intersection was 8. Last one is, are the diagonals perpendicular? Well, I'm going to put my protractor on here, and I want to see if I get a 90-degree angle, and I don't. Okay, so no, the diagonals are not perpendicular. So to fill out the rest of our rectangle, the diagonals were equal. The diagonals did bisect each other. And no, they were not perpendicular. Okay? So that fills out our rectangle. Our next shape is our square. Okay, so here's our square. And I want to check the side lengths. I'm going to measure all 4 sides. I get 11.1. I get 11.1. I get 11.1. And I get 11.1. So as far as my sides go, and my square is at the top, my opposite sides were congruent. My adjacent sides were congruent. Now I want to check angles. I want to see if they're congruent. So I'm going to get my protractor. And based on the definition of a square, all 4 angles should be right angles. So I should get 90 degrees on all 4 angles. And I'm measuring each one to show you that all 4 angles are 90 degrees. So when I come back to my table here, were the opposite angles congruent? Yes. Were the adjacent angles congruent? Yes. And because it's a parallelogram, they're also supplementary. And now I need to look at the diagonals. So I'm going to draw the diagonals of the square. And then I'm going to measure them because it asks if they're equal. So I'll get about 15.6 or 7. If I measure the other one, I get 15.6 or 7. All right, so that does mean the diagonals are equal. Do they bisect each other? Well, I get about 7.8 on this diagonal piece and 7.8 on the other, so those are bisected. Then I have to check the other side. I get about 7.8 here and 7.8 there as well. So yes, the diagonals are bisected. Are they perpendicular? So now I'm going to take my protractor and line it up. It does hit 90, so that does mean it is perpendicular. So coming back to our chart, our properties chart, the diagonals were equal. The diagonals do bisect each other. And the diagonals are perpendicular. So everything gets checked off on the square. Our last shape is our rhombus for today. And I'm going to start off measuring the sides. So I get about 8.3. Oh, this one's about 8.7. This may not be a rhombus. Yep, that's 8.3. And that's more than 8.3. Okay, so this is actually not a rhombus. But we can still go over the properties of a rhombus. Okay, on the properties of a rhombus, were the opposite sides congruent? Yes, by definition, they would be congruent. Adjacent sides congruent? Yes. If all four sides have to be congruent, then the adjacent sides would have to be congruent. Are the opposite sides congruent? Yes. And that would be because it is a parallelogram, and if it works in a parallelogram, it's going to work in a rhombus. Are the adjacent angles congruent? No, they are not. However, since it is a parallelogram, they still will be supplementary. Are the diagonals equal? No. Just like it is in a parallelogram, they are not going to be equal. Do they bisect each other? Yes, they will. They will split each other in half because it's a property of a parallelogram. And are the diagonals perpendicular? Yes, they will be perpendicular. If we had a rhombus to show you. There's one additional property that's not on here that I want to add, and that is the diagonal bisects the opposite angle. The diagonal bisects opposite angles. And since that applies to the rhombus, it's also going to apply to our square. So I want to add that to our square as well. Diagonal bisects opposite angles. And there's another one that I want to add to parallelogram. Okay? It's a property that if it's true, then it makes it a parallelogram. So if you have one side parallel and congruent, then we can make it a parallelogram. So you could also have one side parallel and congruent, and it would be a parallelogram. And that would also apply to our rectangle, our rhombus, and our square. Because if it applies to our parallelogram, a square is a parallelogram, a rectangle is a parallelogram, and a rhombus is a parallelogram. Okay, so we're going to use these properties in our assignments.